Hi, I'm Tim Barton.
And I'm David Barton.
And we're back with another lesson on footsteps to freedom. And we've talked previously about different forms of government. We talked about jurisdiction and actually even using metrics to say what things work and what things don't work. And it's pretty easy as you look at world history. You can see some nations have been very successful. You can see some nations have really struggled with freedom and with prosperity, with stability. And if you see some nations are successful, some nations don't do a good job, well, then it really does raise the question, what are the principles that are being applied in the nations that are successful, and what are principles applied in nations that aren't successful? Because if we know what the principles are, we can say, well, let's apply the successful principles in our nation. Let's stay away from the principles that have not been successful. And this is where, for us, we can look at America. And even though America's never been a perfect nation, even though we can point to leaders in American history who weren't great leaders, and actually, many people today still might not like America, there are things about America where you can measure metrics and say, statistically, we've done very well here, maybe not always great here, but you can use metrics and see where you've been successful and where you need to improve.
There really are things that America has done well. And when you look at America, things like stability, America has had one constitution for over 200 years, and the average length of a constitution in the history of the world for all of the nations is only 17 years. Other nations average a violent revolution every generation or so. Not in America. It has been years and decades and generations since we've had that. So we have stability, unlike other nations. We also have prosperity, unlike other nations. When you look at creativity, we have that unlike other nations. America is only 4% of the world's population, and yet by world statistics, every year, America produces more inventions, more innovations, more discoveries, more cures, more everything than the other 96% of the world combined. And it's not because we have greater natural resources. For example, American agriculture produces enough food every year to feed the world. And America is only 66 in the world in percentage of farmable land. So we have much less farmable land than other nations, and yet we make it produce more than others. So these are things in America that we can measure and produce. And there's certainly, as you mentioned, other nations that really don't like America, and that's fine, but there are principles we have used that are productive, and those principles will work for any nation that uses those principles.
Well, and you can even see this when you look at world nations, where some nations are now very economically prosperous, very economically productive, and actually if you took a place like North and South Korea, I mean, they were one Korea for a long time, and then of course the Korean War, and they were divided along the 38th parallel, but they have the same heritage, the same culture. Actually, arguably, North Korea has even better land when it comes to farmable land, and yet South Korea is one of the top 10 economic producers. North Korea has not really been that well for the people. So many have starved and they're struggling to survive. It really is a situation you can look and say, what were the principles they applied? And it's not because it was a special group and South Korea is just better than North Korea. No, it's they applied principles that were not applied in North Korea. The same thing with America. You can look at America, and it's not that America has been more special. It's not that America has better people. Well, of course not. It's there's principles that work, and principles that when applied, no matter who applies them, the principles that you can see that lead to productivity. In fact, one of the principles is where there is more economic freedom, where there is more individual freedom to actually be an entrepreneur, to actually be productive, when you can be rewarded for your own productivity, you can see actually those nations tend to produce more, which is why in America, because we've been a very economically free nation for so long, it really isn't a surprise that we've been very productive, because there's many nations much smaller than us that are now enjoying economic productivity because they've applied the same principles of freedom. It's not America, it's principles, and any nation can apply them and be successful.
And you know, America didn't invent the principles that we're using right now. No. Those principles were there for a long time before. And it's interesting that from a governmental stability standpoint, we are talking about law and government in this particular course, Footsteps of Freedom. As you look at that law and government, and there have been governments all over the world, there's almost 200 nations in the world today, which means 200 governments. So there's a lot to look at, but the principles we have, when you look at our documents and you look at the stability we have and the lack of revolution and the longevity of our documents, you go, what principles did you use? And that was actually a question that was asked by political science professors here in the United States. That said, where did we get these principles? And they actually produced this book right here. This book is The Origins of American Constitutionalism. And they said, you know, we think if we can back up into the 1750s and 1760s and 1770s and 1780s when we were building our government, if we can see who our founding fathers quoted, we'll know where they got their ideas. And so they did that. They took 15,000 representative writings out of the founding era. They went through and found 3,154 direct quotes, and it took them 10 years, but they took every quote back to its original source. And as they go back to the sources of all the thousands of years of human history, all the millions of books that have been written putting forth ideas, it turned out that there were some sources that were way up top on the list of whom Americans quoted, who they looked to. So when you look at the results, they found that the single most cited individual in the American founding period was a French philosopher named Baron Charles Montesquieu. So he's the number one cited source. 8.3% of all quotes in the founding era came from this work here from 1750. The second most cited individual in the American founding was an English judge named Blackstone, is Sir William Blackstone. He was a commentator on the laws. He did this 4-volume set of the laws back in 1766. 7.9% of all quotes in the founding era came from this English judge. The third most cited individual in the founding era was an English philosopher. His name was John Locke. This is one of his major books. It's called The Two Treatises of Government. He wrote this in 1690. So these are the three individuals that are the most cited individuals in the American founding.
Now you're saying individuals, which to me suggests that there might be something that wasn't just an individual writer, but maybe there's a source who's not a specific individual, so not Montesquieu or Blackstone or John Locke. Was there something else maybe that founding fathers might have referenced or quoted often?
There was. While you had Montesquieu at 8.3%, and you had Blackstone at 7.9%, and you had John Locke at 2.9%, the Bible had 34% of all quotes in the founding era. That's a whole lot more than these guys even put together. The number one most influential source in the American founding, the source from which they drew principles most often, was the Bible.
It's interesting because the Bible certainly does deal with the issue of human nature and how humans operate. And certainly in the Bible, there's God, and He has laws and commands for His people, and then there's Jesus. And obviously, it's a religious book. But in the midst of it, He actually, there's a period where the Israelites are in Egypt, and He leads them out of Egypt, and they're going to be their own people. And then when they become their own people, He has to give them a law for how should your government operate. And so part of what the Bible is, in the midst of it being a history book, it also is a history book that recounts how they formed their government, which apparently, if 34% of all the founding quotes came out of that, would seem to be that that's where they're learning even the way government could or should operate. Now, certainly Montesquieu talks about the idea of man and government. Blackstone, of course, he's dealing with law, so he talks about government. John Locke's a really interesting guy in his two treatises of government, because he actually was writing specifically dealing with the divine right of kings. And at that time in England, the king said, I am God's representative. God chose me. I'm His favorite. And so everything I say is representing God. And actually, one of the arguments that was being made at that time was people saying that from the very beginning, God had always wanted kings. And so you actually can go back, the very first man in recorded human history was Adam. And so the argument was made that Adam was the first king. Well, John Locke comes in and says, wait a second. You can't use the Bible to make it say things it doesn't say. So the majority of his book is actually going back and looking at what does the Bible actually say about government? What does it say about the divine right of kings? What does it say about man's responsibility? And so even though this is a book dealing with government and kings, it really is even a book dealing with how you should read the Bible and apply the Bible to government or kings.
This is called The Two Treatises of Government. And the first treatise or first writing was a refutation of Sir Robert Filmer, who was saying divine right of kings, Adam was a king, and everybody's sense had been. And so you're right. John Locke said, you're not even using the Bible right. And so he in this little book, less than 400 pages, about an inch thick, he references the Bible over 1,500 times. So in the first treatise, he says, no, 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 let's look at what God said about government. And in the second treatise, he says, now that we've pointed out what government is not supposed to do, that it was not Adam as a king, let's see what government is supposed to do. And so then he comes through and he says, this is what God intended for government to do. These are the principles of government. When people come together in a community and social compact, here's the principles that should guide that government. And so this is the book that was a favorite of Founding Fathers. As a matter of fact, in the period in which we wrote our Declaration of Independence to separate from Great Britain, this document right here, he was the single most cited individual in the period of the Declaration. Now, as you get into the period of the Constitution, it moves into Montesquieu and Blackstone, but in the period of we're going to be a free nation, John Locke is the guy.
So they're looking back at ideas that have been argued for a long time, and so America was trying to figure out, what do we do? Because at that time, they were under a tyrannical king, and the king was imposing things on them, and they believed that there were certain basic truths of life. And they believed the king did not have the same values they did and actually was oppressing them in a lot of ways. They thought he was very tyrannical. And so they drafted the Declaration. In the Declaration, they give 27 reasons why they thought the king was violating what they believed were their rights. And so where you really see their philosophy of government first outlined.
Let's take this document for a minute and look at this document, because when you look at this, this is the birth certificate for America. But this is where they told the world, here's our philosophy of government. We've been reading, studying all these principles. And so they start up top with 155 words that say, here's 6 principles of government. And then after that, they gave, as you mentioned, the 27 grievances saying, here's 27 examples of how these principles have been violated. And so at the end, they say, now we're going to create a new government. And it's based on these 6 principles.
And the idea from the new government was to protect what you're saying. In their philosophy, they outlined 6 principles of what government should do. They said, here's where it has not done that, but then we're going to start a government to do that. So really the question then is, what are those 6 principles that they believed would make a good government? And then, were those actually good principles?
There are 6 principles. And the first of those principles was that there is absolute truth. There are absolute rights and wrongs. I mean, this is what principles are based on.
Now, you're saying they have a principle that it's absolute truth. But, so having read the Declaration, I can imagine if somebody reads the Declaration, they're going, okay, where's the principle of absolute truth? Because it doesn't say absolute truth in the Declaration. Right. So where do we draw that principle from?
Where they draw it from was actually the writings of William Blackstone, and they quoted from him where he said that there are the laws of nature and the laws of revelation. And in the Declaration, they said, we have the laws of nature and of nature's God. Now, Sir William Blackstone explained, he said, God has revealed himself in 2 ways. One is through his creation in nature. If you look at nature, nature tells us certain things are right and wrong, and it doesn't matter what human law you pass, you're not going to change certain behavior because this is a law of nature. But Blackstone also pointed out, said, you know, when man fell, when man sinned, Adam and Eve in the garden, since then, our understanding has not been as clear as it should on what's right and wrong. And so God, in compassion for our frailty, said, let me just write it down for you. And that's what we call the Scripture, the revelation of God, the Bible. So between the laws of nature and the laws of nature's God, which is what we talk about in the Declaration, we find a standard for what's right and wrong and for what's true and for what's not true.
So Blackstone says a lot of those things are already revealed in nature. Now, a lot of people could look today at nature and say, wait a second, what are the laws revealed in nature? Well, if you look at nature, there's a few basic things you can start with. For example, the idea of liberty. Do you know of the more than 10 million species, there's not a single species that's born into slavery, apart maybe from humans. But you can look at nature and realize, you know, slavery is not a normal condition. You don't see animals enslaving other animals. So you can look at nature and learn some basic principles that you would go, oh, okay, well, maybe we should do that in life. And that's what Blackstone said. God has revealed part of how life works through nature.
Well, you find other rights in nature as well. For example, it doesn't matter what species you look at of those 10 million in nature, they will defend their own life. They will defend the life of their young, and they will defend what they consider to be their property. And it doesn't matter whether you look at lions and bears or dogs and cats or even mice. they will defend. So there is a right of self-defense in nature. Nature teaches me I have the right to defend my own life, to defend the life of my family, and to defend my property. So that's a law of nature.
Okay, so Blackstone points out that not only are there laws of nature, he then points out that because, in his belief, because man fell into sin, and sin has given us really a clouded view. We can't see clearly right and wrong as well as maybe we used to be able to. He says that's why there's the law of divine revelation. You have the Bible, but what are things that maybe used to be more clear that aren't as clear anymore? Why would you, if you can really learn from creation, why would you need divine revelation or the Bible?
Well, it's interesting that human behavior is what came apart after sin entered. And so if you look at the essence of what's called the moral law, which is something like the Ten Commandments, they kind of supply what happened between men after the fall. For example, murder is a great example. You have murder going on, and you get in the Scriptures moral law like the Ten Commandments, really simple moral law that says, don't murder. That moral law says, don't steal.
If that's in contrast to nature, though, where do you see murder in nature where it's acceptable?
Well, murder in nature, it'd be hard for us to judge what's murder in nature because so much killing goes in nature because they eat one another and they eat other stuff.
So, for example, if an animal kills for food, right, and in that situation we wouldn't really call that murder of an animal, but murder would be maybe if an animal kills another animal just because. Does that really happen in nature?
It does happen in nature. There are occasions in nature where that you have, for example, what we would consider from our standpoint to be wanton killing of others. We live in the country, and for example, if you go into a chicken coop, and if you look in a chicken coop and let a skunk get into a chicken coop, oh my gosh, it's mass murder. The skunk will bite the heads off the chickens and sling their bodies, spray it with blood everywhere, and they don't eat the chickens, they just bite their heads off and kill them. And they will slaughter a whole chicken coop in a matter of an hour. So there is murder that goes on in nature.
And I can imagine if humans left uncontrolled, unrestrained in themselves, if I got angry enough, it's not far-fetched to imagine that I could justify to myself it would be okay to kill. And certainly you could see maybe even some of that nature where I even can think of maybe even some dogs that were mean and another younger pup comes up or something they don't like and they get angry and they kill the dog. And so you probably could see examples of some of that in nature. And so maybe that's where in the Ten Commandments, God says, well, don't murder. Because even if you're frustrated, even if you're angry, even if you can point to examples where it happens in nature, that's still something that we would say is wrong.
That's right. And that moral code, that moral law, and again, the Ten Commandments in Western civilization has long been considered the basis of the moral law. Well, when you take the laws of nature and of nature's God, you come together with a set of right and wrongs that creates a moral standard that establishes what truth is. We believe murder is wrong. Shedding innocent blood. Now, you can kill in self-defense. Armies can kill in justified wars. There are occasions of killing that are not murder. But when you kill an innocent person simply because you want to, when you shed innocent blood, we believe that's always wrong. That is a standard of truth. We don't argue about, well, murder is okay if I feel like it. No. And that's where we start with this. The number one principle of government is there are absolutes. There are rights and wrongs that are absolutes.
And this is where, in the Declaration, they start off with this idea there's a fixed moral law. And as you're mentioning, Blackstone talks a lot about this. In fact, has page after page after page after page really explaining a lot of this. So even as we're having this discussion, this was already explained pretty well in his books. And the Founding Fathers knew very well what Blackstone said. So in the Declaration they start off with, we're not just making up rules as we go. We believe there's revealed right and wrong. It's revealed in creation. It was revealed in the Bible. And we have a government that has not recognized what should be revealed right and wrong. And so that the first principle they acknowledge is there are rights and wrongs, which they were able to point to say the king wasn't following rights and wrongs. But after they say there are fixed rights and wrongs, they actually point out and say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And there's a whole lot of really valuable things in there because it starts off saying that we believe there is truth. And so again, this isn't subjective. We're not just making something up. Well, to me, I think, well, this is how I feel. No, there is truth. And one of the truths, well, they start off saying that we are created. And if you are created, then you had to have a creator.
That's right.
And if there was a creator, that means that the king is not the most powerful thing in the world. It actually is a creator who is even greater than the king.
And that's the second principle on which we base the government. The first was there are rights and wrongs, there is absolute truth. The second is, by the way, those truths and right and wrong came from a creator. Now, that creator, you said that the king's not the creator. Let's substitute the word government for king, because what you have is, I don't care whether you're the king, whether you're a democracy, whether you're whatever you are, higher than you is the creator. And so what they've established is that government is not the sole power over our lives. There is a power higher than the power of government, and that is the power of the creator. Now that's significant because there is often a belief in many nations that government is the sole power. So what they have done here is they have said, no, government is not the sole authority. There is a power higher than government. And by the way, that is the first step toward having a limited government. We talked in previous lessons about how there are boundaries for government. There are things it's not supposed to do. It does have fences that it's to stay within. In a secular mindset, there are no fences for government except what it makes for itself. We have now said, no, 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 there is something higher than government, and that is the creator, and he actually is the one who makes the fences around government. So that acknowledgement, that open acknowledgement of a creator is a significant part of the American philosophy of government, which goes back to all these other philosophers. It's not that America came up with this. These are principles that have been used, and we learned them. And this is a great example of what we believed. This document happens to be from America's first president, George Washington. He was significant in framing our documents, our form of government, and right here he is calling the nation to a time of publicly acknowledging God. Now, why would he do that? He says in the first line, I'll just read it to you. He says, "It is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor." He's calling the nation saying, guys, the first thing we have a duty as a nation to do is acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, obey His will, be grateful for His benefits, and humbly implore His protection and favor. That has made clear that government is not the source of everything in our lives. There is something higher than government.
Well, it's also interesting that he doesn't say you have to be a Christian in America.
That's right.
You don't have to be part of a religion. He says, but our nation does acknowledge that there is something higher than government, and it is God. And that leads to the next principle, actually, that the individual from America that's really attributed with writing the Declaration is Thomas Jefferson. And after Thomas Jefferson said that we were created, he actually says that we were all created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, it's worth noting, he says that we were created equal because one of the things very common in the history of world governments is class systems. In fact, happens in many nations even to this day. And if you're born into the wrong class, well, you're of less value than somebody born above you. But because we believe there's a divine Creator, if the divine Creator created all of us, then we are all created with a level of equality because we were all made by the same Creator. He says, and we've all been given inalienable rights, and those rights were something that didn't come from government. They came from our Creator, which is then worth noting. He says that among the rights that were given to us were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So not only is there a Creator who gave us rights, we've outlined what a few of those rights are. And when he says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that's something certainly, if you look at world history, not all governments have believed that people had the right to life or liberty or their own pursuit of happiness. So why would we do that in America when that's not really what the world has done in the history of government?
Well, it's significant that what we did in America was, again, we're providing freedom. But the way we did that was we said, hey, government, you're not the one who came up with these rights. God did. And so since they belong to Him, you don't get to mess with them. They're not yours. You cannot touch these rights. So what we did was we said, government, you cannot interfere with the right to life. Every individual is given by God the right to life. You can't interfere with that. And by the way, God gave us the right to liberty. You can't interfere with that. Government is supposed to provide and protect freedom, not put people in slavery.
Right, so the government can't arbitrarily come in and say, wait a second, I don't like you, I'm going to kill you. You slept during one of my meetings, I'm going to kill you. That seems a little arbitrary, but it's happened in the world.
That's right.
And governments would come in and say, you know what, I'm going to enslave you for whatever reason arbitrarily. No. Government, you did not give me my life. You did not give me my liberty. I was born. My Creator gave me life, gave me liberty. Therefore, if government didn't give them, government can't take them away. But it's worth noting that we have rights that came from a Creator. And actually, the Founding Fathers said there were even more rights in those. When they went forward to the Constitution, they laid those out in the Bill of Rights.
The Founding Fathers identified about 24 rights that came from God. And here was the key for them. They said if you look at the first government that ever appeared in the history of the world, whether you study secular history or religious history, there were about 24 rights that came from God. They're seen in nature before any government was created. So they said clearly these are rights not created by a government. They were created by the Creator, who gave them to every individual simply by virtue of the fact that they are human beings.
Okay, well then I need to ask the question. If the rights came before government, the question has to come up, then when did government come into existence? Because if we had those rights first, which of course I would agree we did, then historically, when can you point and say, here's where government, first recorded human history, here's where government happened?
We can point to where government first happened, which also points to the fourth principle that we have in the Declaration. Government first happened when Noah got off the ark. Prior to Noah, and in the Bible, that's in Genesis 9, but it's also recorded in other histories as well. And in Genesis 9 is where we see it. And when Noah got off the ark with his sons and their wives, his families, they were the family that was saved. They were the group that was saved from all the world, because the world had become so corrupt, so much murder, so much theft, so much rape, that God said, I'm going to start over. And so on the new start, as they get off the ark, God says, here's the code of laws by which you will live. Now, scholars call that the Noahide laws. There are 7 categories of laws, and the first law deals with murder. And it says, whoever murders, whoever sheds innocent blood, by man will he be killed. In other words, it's capital punishment.
As you've already identified, Noah is long after the origins of man.
That's right.
So man's already been here a long time, so government came after man already existed. If they were created, they already had the rights from their Creator, which is where you're referencing the Declaration. The fourth point that was illustrated in the Declaration was that government exists to secure our God-given rights, which is very contrary to what much of the world has done. Because much of the world believes that government's the one that gives us our rights. And government's the one that tells us what freedoms we have and what privileges we have and what we can and can't do, contrary to what was actually believed in early America, is that, no, government doesn't give us our rights. Government is here to protect the rights we already had. And as was already identified, you had life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Government exists to protect those rights, not to tell us where we have them or how we can enjoy them. Actually, in America, we also believed you had the freedom of speech. You had the freedom of religion. A lot of other freedoms that before there was ever government, you had the ability to do those things because those rights didn't come from government. They came from God. Government's job is actually to protect our ability to be able to use those rights, right, to live in those rights. But this is very different than what most of the world has done for much of human history.
Yeah, the first priority of government is to make sure that every individual has the right to practice the rights that God gave him. Now, below that, government passes laws, passes regulations. It'll talk to us about speed limits or about fees and fines. But government is not to tell us whether we can or can't worship God according to the dictates of our conscience. Government is not to tell us whether we can or can't defend ourselves if we're attacked. I mean, those are rights that came from the Creator. And that's what's significant, because as the Founding Fathers talked about this and explained it, they pointed back to that first government of Noah. Because the first law that God gave Noah was, if someone murders someone, you take them out. What's that designed to do? It's designed to protect the inalienable right to life. God gave you a right to life. If someone else violates that, government is supposed to take care of that. The second law was about theft. God gave you a right to possess private property, to own things.
You mean the government doesn't own everything?
Well, the government often thinks it does, which that goes back to the second point, that government is not God. There is a creator above government. But if you don't have that mindset that there's a creator, then you will think the government is God and they think they own everything.
Well, in many nations, the government seems to be God. The government acts like God, the government gives rights. And this is why America was so unique and different, because in America, we recognized, although we had grown up in England where there was a tyrannical king, where the king said, no, everything you have is mine. If I want that cow or horse, I'm going to come take your cow or horse. If you grew crops and I like it, I'm going to take it. In fact, your children actually even belong to me. Your son's going to serve my military. Your daughter might be part of my harem. Kings did that kind of stuff. And so it was very unique in America when we said, actually, we believe government is not the one who is God. They're not the ones in charge. And their specific role is to protect the rights that we've already been given. And actually, it's interesting, Jefferson then, or at least the Declaration, it continues on, and it says that after government, well, the reason we know government exists to do that is because you have the consent of the governed. That government exists, but it has to be by the approval of the people, the laws they pass. And if we deem, wait a second, that is not a just law, that's not a good law, we don't have to confer what government is saying.
What you get with that principle of the consent of the governed is that we do get to choose the laws under which we live as long as they don't violate those moral laws or those inalienable rights.
Okay, so that's a great point. So even though the Declaration here in America says we do have the ability to make laws, our laws can't violate what we've already understood to be there's a fixed moral law, there's a God, God gave rights to men, and government's job is to secure those rights. So we can have the consent of the governed, but it can't violate those first four.
It can't violate the first four. We could have a vote that says, let's vote on whether rape should still be a crime. And we could have 95% of the nation say, no, rape is not a crime.
They're wrong.
They're wrong. In America, it still would be a crime because it violates the laws of nature and of nature's God. There is a fixed moral standard. We don't vote on those morals. We vote on whether...
I mean, some people try to vote on morals sometimes.
But that's not appropriate.
The principle is that you don't get to vote to change moral rights and wrongs.
That's right. And you don't get to vote to change inalienable rights. You can't vote to take away my liberty. You can't vote to take away my right to defend myself. You can't vote to take away my right to own property.
So if we voted and said all gray-haired people with bluish gray eyes wearing blue shirts should be put in prison,
look out.
That would be a violation of your rights, and therefore that would be an immoral law, could not be passed or should not be passed under that philosophy of government.
Now, we talked earlier about John Locke's 2 treatises of government, and he went through referencing the Bible 1,500 times of what government should do, and he's the one that talks about social compact laws. And social compact laws are the civil laws that fall below the level of inalienable rights and God-given rights and wrongs. For example, things that a government could vote on, we could vote on whether the sidewalk should be 4 feet wide, 5 feet wide, or 6 feet wide. We could vote on whether the speed limit should be 45 miles an hour if you happen to be in the English system, or 55 miles an hour, or if you happen to be in Texas, our system, 85 miles an hour. I mean, you can vote on that, but you cannot vote on someone's inalienable rights, and you cannot vote on moral rights and wrongs that are established in the laws of nature and nature's God.
And the Founding Fathers believed that the people had a right to be able to be represented. They should have a voice in this.
That's right.
So we do believe it's not just whatever the king tells you. You actually should have a right to be able to vote and say, this is what I think, and this is what we should do, and we should protect this, and actually, I think we should only have stop signs here, maybe stoplights over there, and we should be able to vote on things, and under the king, they really weren't given the ability to have their voice be heard.
Well, but even if you did vote, what's the measurement for who's right and who's wrong under social compact laws where you don't have morals? We measure it by the will of the majority. In a constitutional Republican form of government, you don't have a vote that goes 60-40 and the 40 win. The 60 win. If it's 51-49, the 51 win. So the consent of the governed is measured by the majority who are for it. Now again, the majority is not right on every occasion, and that's why you have certain things set aside, the laws of nature, nature's God, inalienable rights. But you can vote on the other things. Those are relative kind of regulations. And the way we measure that is the majority wins.
So here's what's interesting. after they've gone through those first 5 principles, that there are fixed moral laws, there was a divine creator, he gave rights to men, government's job is to protect those rights, you had the consent of the governed, the last thing they said before they listed the 27 problems with the king, they explained that if a government fails to do those things, the first 5 principles, it's the right of the people to alter, to abolish, to throw off, and form a new government, which is why they're explaining, King, you've done all these things to violate those basic principles, so we believe it's our right to say we don't have to live under oppression. It would be very similar if there was a boyfriend-girlfriend scenario and the boyfriend has been incredibly abusive to the girlfriend. We would say she has the right to dump him, break up with him, right? Go find a new boyfriend or be single for a while, right? Enjoy your freedom, fine. And this is kind of what we said in the Declaration, is that because there was an abusive relationship, it's the right of the people to step back from that abusive relationship and say, I have the right not to be beaten every night before I go to bed. I have that right.
That's exactly right. And it was, again, John Locke was so influential in the Declaration. It goes back to the purpose of government. What is the purpose of government? It's to protect your inalienable rights. If government does not do that but abuses your rights, if it becomes an abusive spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend, I've got the right to break up and go get someone who's going to do what they should do. By the way, sometimes that requires civil disobedience. Sometimes that requires disobeying civil laws. Sometimes that requires going even further. And the concept of standing up for right against civil government is not necessarily a bad concept if it's built on the right principles. For me to stand up against government just because I don't like what they're doing, that's not sufficient. But if you're violating principles that have been set up by the Creator, by the laws of nature and nature's God, those are universal laws, and the government does not have the right to violate those laws. And so one of the very, very famous sermons in American history was this sermon out of 1750. And it is called Concerning Unlimited Submission and Non-Resistance to Higher Powers. When is it right and wrong to stand up against government? And you can't do it just because you're having a bad day or government's having a bad day.
And actually, even if you do stand up to an oppressive, abusive government, it doesn't come without cost.
That's right.
Now, it might be the right thing to do, but it could be very costly to do it.
Let's take an example from the Bible that a lot of people might recognize if you know or read the Bible. You have Daniel, Daniel was in Babylonian Empire, and he was told you're not allowed to pray to God individually. He said, that's wrong. And he went ahead and disobeyed the law, and he prayed to God individually. He did the right thing, praying, but he still paid a penalty. They still threw him in the lion's den. Now, granted, God delivered him from the lion's den, but that doesn't mean that every time you do what's right and suffer a penalty, you're going to get delivered, because there were a lot who died in the Colosseum in Rome standing for their faith and for what was right. So there is a penalty you may have to pay, but you want to stand for what's right. And that's what we see in the Bible, and the Hebrew midwives and Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children. There's so many in the Bible that stood up against bad government. They paid a price for it, but they stood up in what we call civil disobedience.
Well, it's interesting, the Founding Fathers, too, the very end of the Declaration, they said that we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They knew it might cost them everything to go forth with this last principle, but they said freedom is important enough to us. It's the rights that we want our kids and our grandkids to have, the ability to worship God according to our own conscience. These principles are important enough. We're willing to pay everything, risk everything, and obviously it's fortunate it worked out for him. It could be a very different scenario had it not worked out for him, but this is where when you see those principles, the principles that there are moral rights and wrongs, there is something higher than government. Yeah. So government's not the one that determines and dictates.
And even as they close the Declaration with that, our lives, fortune, sacred honor, they also said, we appeal to the supreme judge of the universe for the rectitude of our intentions. We're not having a revolution just to have a revolution.
We're not just trying to be rebellious.
We're not trying to be rebellious children. We're appealing to the supreme judge. We think we have laid this out on the basis of the laws he has given. We think we're doing the right thing before him, and he will be the one to ultimately judge us.
And we'll let him be our judge. So they believe there was a divine creator. They believe that he's the one that had given rights. They believe that government's role, primary function, was to protect the rights all humans were given. They believed that all humans should have a voice. There should be consent of the governed. We should be able to vote and have a part of what's going on. And if we have a government that fails to recognize rights and wrongs, that fails to recognize they're not God, that fails to recognize our rights, that fails to protect our rights, that doesn't even allow us to participate, if this happens, it's our right to say, I want out of this abusive relationship. I don't want to be your girlfriend anymore, right? I want something different, which is ultimately what we did in America. And it's those principles that you can see that actually have made America a very unique and different nation. Now, that doesn't mean we haven't had people in American government who were abusive at times. We certainly have. We haven't always had a people that followed the moral laws and values, that were always people of high character. We haven't always recognized inalienable rights. We've never been a perfect nation, but the principles upon which our nation was built were principles that actually overcame a lot of imperfect people and actually allowed America to be a pretty exceptional and special place.